What if everything you thought you knew about ancient Egypt came from the monuments, and almost none of it came from the people who actually lived there? At the height of Egypt's New Kingdom, roughly 3,300 years ago, a civilization of perhaps 3 to 4 million souls stretched from the cataracts of Nubia to the edges of Canaan, and the vast majority of those people never once entered a temple, never stood before a throne, and never saw their names carved in stone. The biblical story of Moses does not begin in a palace. It begins in the mud. Stand at the edge of the Nile Delta in the eastern reaches of Egypt, somewhere around the 13th century BCE, and the first thing you notice is the smell. River silt, wet and dark and faintly metallic, mixing with wood smoke from morning fires and the sharp green scent of onion tops bent by a light northern wind. The air is already warm before sunrise. Workers are moving through it. This is not the Egypt of gold-leafed sarcophagi. This is the Egypt where a labourer rises before the sun has cleared the eastern horizon, drinks a portion of thick fermented barley beer, eats a flat loaf of bread baked the previous evening, and walks toward the canal before the heat arrives. This is the Egypt the Bible is actually describing, and once you see how this civilization actually worked, from the canal systems to the labour camps, to the temple granaries, to the foreign settlements in the eastern delta, the story of Moses stops being distant. It becomes something you can almost touch. Egypt in this period was not simply a kingdom, it was a machine of breathtaking scale, extraordinary organisation, and for those at its base, relentless demand. The New Kingdom, spanning roughly 1550 to 1070 BCE, represented the absolute peak of Egyptian imperial power. Pharaoh commanded armies reaching into Syria. Administrators collected grain taxes from settlements hundreds of miles in every direction. Royal building projects consumed tens of thousands of workers across decades. The city most closely linked to the biblical account of the Israelites was called Pi-Ramesses, constructed on a massive scale under Pharaoh Ramesses II, whose reign spanned an extraordinary 66 years. Archaeological excavations at the modern site of Kantir in the eastern Nile Delta have revealed the outlines of what was once one of the largest cities in the ancient world, covering roughly 10 square miles. It contained royal palaces, military barracks, enormous chariot horse stables, administrative offices, weapons workshops, and temple precincts. This was no provincial outpost. It was an economic command centre controlling the movement of grain, labour, and military resources across Egypt's entire northeastern frontier. The Bible's book of Exodus refers to the Israelites building a city called Ramesses, alongside a city called Pithom. Egyptian texts confirm that both names correspond to real sites in the eastern delta. These were real coordinates in a real landscape, and the labour systems that built them were documented in Egyptian administrative records with the kind of bureaucratic precision that only a very confident empire bothers to maintain. Now step away from the city walls and walk the fields. The Nile Delta was a landscape of remarkable agricultural abundance, and understanding that abundance means understanding the mechanism that produced it. Every year, without fail, the Nile flooded. The waters came from summer monsoon rains deep in the Ethiopian highlands, arriving in Egypt in late June or early July with slow, unstoppable regularity. For roughly 3 months, floodwaters spread across the valley floor, depositing a layer of dark, extraordinarily fertile silt across everything they touched. Egyptian farmers did not simply wait for this gift, they engineered it. Networks of basin irrigation channels divided the floodplain into compartments. Earth embankments directed water into shallow basins where silt settled, then drained it back into the main channel before planting season. Ancient stone measurement tools called nilometers tracked flood levels at key points along the river, and inscriptions on these gauges reveal that Egyptian administrators had calculated, over centuries of observation, that the ideal flood height was between 16 and 18 cubits at the gauge near Memphis. Below that level, harvests fell short. Above it, entire villages could be destroyed. The Egyptian calendar was not an administrative convenience. It was a survival technology. The 3 seasons Egyptians divided the year into flood, emergence, and harvest were operational directives. When the flood arrived, farming stopped and state labor began. When waters receded, planting started. When grain was cut, tax collectors followed within weeks. Every Egyptian farmer understood this cycle not as nature, but as divine order. Either the flooding was the act of the god Hapi. The rich black soil was the substance of Osiris. Religion and agriculture in Egypt were not separate categories. They were the same category, and the state governed both. Now follow a worker into the village. Most Egyptians did not live in stone buildings. Stone was for gods and kings. The material of ordinary Egyptian life was mud brick, made from Nile alluvial clay mixed with sand and chopped straw, packed into wooden moulds and dried in the sun. Excavations at the workers' village of Deir el-Medina, west of ancient Thebes, have given archaeologists a detailed picture of New Kingdom housing. A typical house measured about 5 meters wide and 15 meters long, running deep in a series of connected rooms. The front room was the most public space, with a raised mud brick platform for sitting and receiving guests. A central room held a low hearth for cooking and flat grinding stones for flour. Grinding grain was not a minor chore. Turning dried barley or wheat into usable flour required kneeling over a curved stone slab and pushing a handstone forward and back repeatedly for hours. Analysis of skeletal remains from New Kingdom sites shows the physical consequences. Many women's spines display significant lumbar wear, and several skeletons show arthritic changes in the knees and shoulders beginning in the mid-20s. This is where the story stops being romantic. Back rooms held storage jars sunk into the earthen floor to keep contents cool, wooden chests for linen clothing, and sleeping mats woven from reeds. Light came from small clay oil lamps using linseed or animal fat, burning roughly 3 to 4 hours on a small charge. Oil was an agricultural commodity tracked in administrative records and allocated to workers in measured quantities. Working families managed their lamp oil carefully. The smell of a New Kingdom Egyptian house was specific. Dried grain in storage jars gave off a faint dusty sweetness. The clay oven carried persistent char and old bread. Reed mats smelled of dry grass or old damp. In houses with domestic animals sharing the courtyard, which was common in rural settlements, warm animal odour mixed with everything else. You lived close to your neighbours, close to your animals, and close to your work. Now look at what is being prepared at the hearth. Bread was not simply food in ancient Egypt. Bread was civilization, and the preserved loaves found in tombs include more than 40 distinct varieties. Model bakeries placed in elite tombs show the full production sequence: soaking grain, grinding flour, kneading dough, shaping loaves, loading clay ovens. Beer was the other half of the staple pair, a thick, nutritious liquid made by partially baking bread, crumbling it into water with germinated grain, fermenting, and straining the result. It contained significant calories, B vitamins, and a low but real alcohol content, consumed by adults and children alike, by farmers and administrators, by labourers on state projects, and by priests after performing rituals. Workers on large-scale state projects were paid in rations of bread and beer measured in standardized daily quantities. And Egyptian administrative papyri from Deir el-Medina record ration distributions in careful detail. A standard daily ration for a skilled worker included approximately 10 loaves of bread and between 1 and 2 jugs of beer. Supervisors received 25 loaves. Senior officials received 50. Think about what that means. There was no money changing hands at the gate of a construction site. There was a scribe with a papyrus scroll recording how many loaves each worker received, filing the record for audit. This was a fully functional economic system operating without coinage, sustained entirely by the agricultural output of the Nile Valley and the precision of the Egyptian scribal class. Vegetables supplemented the diet heavily. Onions appear constantly in Egyptian records, both as food and as ritual offering. Garlic, lentils, and cucumbers and leeks were common. Dried Nile fish provided the primary animal protein for most households. Meat, meaning cattle or goat, was rare for ordinary people, appearing at festivals or as special rations for elite workers on important projects. Papyrus records show periodic meat allocations used as management tools, rewarding productivity or marking significant milestones with better food. This is the table at which the Bible's Israelites ate, not metaphorically. This was the actual food system they existed within. Now step outside and follow the sun east toward the fields. Farmers cultivated wheat, barley, and flax using wooden ploughs tipped with copper or bronze, drawn by oxen across soil softened by months of standing floodwater. A skilled farmer with 2 oxen could work roughly 1 to 2 acres per day. An Egyptian family holding a standard allotment of 2 to 4 acres could produce enough barley in a good year to feed themselves, pay their state tax obligation, and maintain a small reserve. But here is the detail almost nobody mentions. That tax obligation was not calculated on what you actually harvested. State surveyors measured each farm plot after the flood and estimated the expected yield based on flood height and soil quality. The tax was owed on that estimate. If a crop failed due to insects or disease after a high flood year, the farmer still owed the estimated amount. Penalties for default included seizure of property and forced labour assignment. Scribes who oversaw these assessments were among the most powerful figures in ordinary Egyptian life. Their decisions determined whether a family ate adequately or went hungry, whether a father kept his land or lost it, whether a son farmed or was conscripted. Harvest season, arriving around March and April, was simultaneously joyful and anxious. Workers moved through fields in organised lines cutting grain with copper sickles, binding sheaves, loading donkeys. Tax collectors arrived at the threshing floor before the grain was stored, taking the state's portion directly from the pile. Tomb paintings from wealthy New Kingdom estates show supervisors standing over workers, scribes crouching nearby with papyrus sheets, and the entire scene watched, always watched. After harvest, when fields lay bare in summer heat, the Nile began its rise again. And with that rise, the labour assignments changed. When floodwaters covered the agricultural fields, farmers became builders. The state organised these seasonal labour drafts through a system of regional conscription, administered by district officials and monitored by scribes. A man whose fields were underwater for 3 months could be sent anywhere the state needed workers. Canal digging, temple construction, quarrying, transport of stone over desert roads. The scale of what Egyptian state labour accomplished is genuinely staggering. The main hypostyle hall at Karnak contained 134 stone columns, the tallest rising to about 21 metres. The stone was quarried at Gebel Silsila, hundreds of miles to the south, transported by barge, unloaded, shaped and raised, using ramps of compacted rubble, and an army of labourers who scratched brief graffiti into the stone faces recording their work gangs. Pyramesses itself was constructed with comparable organisational force. Administrative texts refer to work gangs at this site, including apiru, a term used for various foreign worker groups, alongside Egyptian labourers and other conscripted populations. The entire labour machine ran the same way everywhere. Food from state granaries, tools from state workshops, assignments from scribes, oversight from foremen, and above everyone, Pharaoh, in whose name every shovel of earth was theoretically moved. Now walk away from the construction site and enter the city. Markets in Egyptian towns operated without a fixed marketplace in the modern sense. Trade happened at the river's edge, near granary gates, in front of temple storerooms, and along main streets. Buyers and sellers negotiated through a system of equivalency values based on standardized measures of grain or copper Deben weights. A copper Deben, weighing approximately 91 grams, served as a unit of account even when no actual copper changed hands. You could say that a jar of oil was worth 4 Deben without producing any metal. The mental calculation was the currency. Tomb paintings from elite New Kingdom burials show market scenes with vivid specificity. Women seated behind piles of bread rolls, men carrying jars on shoulder yokes, a sandal maker gesturing at his work, a trader holding up a necklace of blue faience beads. These are not artistic conventions. They are recordings of a real economic environment that operated every day across the Nile Valley. Craftsmen occupied distinct and respected social positions. Carpenters built furniture, coffins, and boat components. Then potters shaped the thousands of storage and cooking vessels that appear in every archaeological deposit from the period. Weavers produced white linen garments, Egypt's most characteristic textile, in large workshops staffed predominantly by women and attached to temple estates. And at the very centre of the economic machine were the scribes, not high administrators, but basic trained copyists and calculators sitting in every village granary, every harbour, every construction site. Egypt ran on papyrus. Without scribes, the entire machine ground to a halt. A trained scribe in New Kingdom Egypt was exempt from manual labour conscription, received guaranteed rations, and held in his reed pen the actual mechanism of state power. The Book of Exodus describes Israelite labour in Egypt with the specific language of supervisors, taskmasters, and labour quotas. Egyptian records use exactly these categories. The administrative vocabulary matches. Now leave the market and enter the precinct of the gods. There is no way to describe daily life in ancient Egypt without passing through religion, because in ancient Egypt, religion was not a separate category of experience. It was the organizing principle of everything. The Egyptian cosmos was not a backdrop to human activity. It was a living, fragile system that required constant maintenance, and the institution responsible for that maintenance was the temple. Stand at the outer gate of a New Kingdom temple complex and look at the first pylon, the massive trapezoidal entrance tower marking the threshold between the human world and the divine. At Karnak, each pylon rose roughly 40 metres and stretched 113 metres across its face. These were not decorative structures. They were theological statements in stone. Pass through the pylon into a hypostyle court open to the sky. Move deeper. The court's narrow, the ceilings lower, the light diminishes. This is the deliberate architectural grammar of Egyptian sacred space, using physical constriction to communicate increasing concentration of divine power. The innermost sanctuary held the divine statue, a figure of the god in gold, gilded wood, or semi-precious stone, placed inside a sealed wooden shrine. In Egyptian theology, the god was actually present in the statue during ritual performance. Priests approached following strict protocols of purification: shaved heads, linen clothing, ritual hand-washing at the temple's sacred lake. They opened the shrine, dressed the statue, presented food offerings, performed spoken recitations, applied cosmetic ointments, and sealed the shrine again. This ritual was performed 3 times daily in every major Egyptian temple. The theological logic was specific. The gods needed sustenance just as humans did. If the gods were not fed and honoured, the divine force sustaining Ma'at, the cosmic balance keeping Egypt orderly and prosperous, would weaken. A weakened divine order meant the Nile could flood catastrophically, enemies could invade, disease could spread. The daily temple ritual was not prayer in the sense of petition, it was maintenance, the way you maintain machinery. This understanding of the gods as living presences requiring material care is essential context for the biblical narrative. When Moses stands before Pharaoh and demands the release of the Israelites, the confrontation is not simply political. In Egyptian terms, it is cosmological. Pharaoh is the divine intermediary personally obligated to maintain Ma'at. A labour population demanding release threatens not just the economy, but the theological order he exists to uphold. The resistance of Pharaoh in Exodus makes a different kind of sense once you understand what he believed his role to be. Now look at what the priests were actually managing. A major New Kingdom temple was not just a religious institution, it was an economic powerhouse. The temple of Amun at Karnak during the reign of Rameses III reportedly controlled more than 700,000 acres of farmland, approximately 500 gardens, 433 orchards, 83 ships, and over 80,000 people as temple workers and serfs. These numbers come from the Harris Papyrus, one of the longest surviving papyri from ancient Egypt. The income from these holdings funded the daily ritual, the construction of temple buildings, the salaries of the scribal staff, and the elaborate public festivals that were among the few times ordinary Egyptians could actually enter temple precincts. Festival days brought massive distributions of bread, beer, and meat to the population, turning theological events into community feasts. The Opet festival at Thebes lasted between 11 and 27 days, during which the statue of Amun was carried in a golden bark from Karnak to Luxor Temple, roughly 2 miles to the south, accompanied by priests, musicians, dancers, and enormous crowds. This is the world of organized religion that the Bible's Israelites lived within. Not a vague spiritual background, a specific, physically present, economically powerful institution that owned the land they farmed, managed the granaries that stored their grain, supervised the projects they built, and enforced a theological system in which their own God had no recognized place. Now look directly at the social structure that held all of this together. Egyptian society was hierarchical in a way that modern eyes sometimes struggle to fully grasp, because the hierarchy was not purely economic. It was theological. At the absolute apex stood Pharaoh, understood not as a man who happened to hold political office, but as the divine son of Ra, the earthly embodiment of Horus, and after death, the incarnation of Osiris. Every inscription in every temple, every seal on every administrative document invoked Pharaoh's name as the source of legitimate authority. He did not merely issue orders. In Egyptian understanding, his orders expressed divine will. Below Pharaoh spread the administrative class, viziers, regional governors, treasury officials, military commanders, chief priests, and the scribes who documented everything. Below them were skilled craftsmen. Below the craftsmen came the mass of agricultural labourers and general workers who formed the base of the pyramid. And below even this group were the people with no land, no recognised status, and no administrative category that protected them. Foreign populations assigned to labour duties, prisoners of war, displaced groups dependent on state rations with no independent economic base. Egyptian texts describe these groups with bureaucratic precision but rarely with sympathy. The Leiden Papyrus records deliveries of stone to construction sites with worker lists, including notations for Asiatic populations. The language is that of inventory management. Now watch what this looked like from the inside. Step into the world of a foreign labourer in the Eastern Delta around 1270 BCE. You have arrived in Egypt, or were brought here, as part of a work group from the Levant. You speak a Semitic language. You understand enough Egyptian to respond to basic commands. You live in a settlement near the construction site, in mud brick buildings that are functional but not designed for comfort. Your daily routine is structured by rations. A scribe from the site administration distributes 10 loaves of bread from the state granary in the morning. Your supervisor on the same project receives 25. A senior official receives 50. You carry water, cut brick moulds, mix mud with straw, carry formed bricks to the drying area, and after they harden in the sun, carry them to the wall being built. A single mud brick weighs roughly 3.5 kilograms. A day of work involves moving hundreds of them. Your hands are calloused. Your lower back aches. The sun on the Delta Plain is merciless from April through October. You are watched. An overseer with a staff walks the work area, noting pace, checking counts, reporting to the scribe. Papyrus records from the period include references to scribes, noting workers for slowness or absence, and recording ration deductions as penalties. Here is the detail that changes the way the Exodus narrative reads. The Book of Exodus describes Egyptian taskmasters requiring the Israelites to produce a fixed daily quota of bricks, then escalating the demand. The same quota must be met without being provided straw. Egyptian production records document exactly this kind of quota system. Work gang records from multiple New Kingdom sites show assigned daily output targets for brick-making crews measured in thousands of bricks per gang per day. This is not background context. This is the actual mechanism the Bible is describing. Now look at the broader picture of foreign communities in the Eastern Delta. The Nile Delta was genuinely multicultural. Archaeological excavations at Tel el-Daba, identified as the ancient city of Avaris in the same region as Pyrameses, have revealed a large Canaanite population occupying the site during the period immediately preceding the New Kingdom. Austrian archaeologist Manfred Biertach's excavations uncovered houses built in Canaanite architectural styles, Levantine pottery, and burial practices using donkey burials characteristic of Canaanite culture rather than Egyptian customs. The historical record confirms that people from the Levant lived, worked, and occasionally rose to administrative authority in the Eastern Delta across several centuries of the second millennium BCE. The word that appears in Egyptian texts with the most striking relevance to the biblical account is apiru, sometimes written as hapiru in other ancient Near Eastern sources. This term appears across a huge geographic range in the second millennium BCE, in Egyptian texts, Mesopotamian texts, the Amarna letters from 14th century BCE Canaan, and Hittite records. It describes a socially marginal category, not a specific ethnic group, but a designation for people existing outside normal social categories, often as stateless labourers, mercenaries, or fugitives working for whoever will hire them. Egyptian texts from the reigns of Amenhotep II and Ramesses II describe apiru being assigned to work projects including stone quarrying and temple construction in the Delta. The proximity of this term to the Hebrew ethnonym has been noted by scholars for over a century. While most specialists resist a simple equation between the two terms, the overlap in social category, geographic location, and historical period is genuinely striking. Now step back and look at the harder reality beneath the surface stability. That Egyptian civilization presented itself, in every inscription and every monument, as a world of perfect divine order. Ma'at prevailed. Pharaoh was eternal. This was the official narrative of ancient Egypt, inscribed on every available stone surface with consistent, meticulous repetition. The papyrus records tell a different story. The Turin Strike Papyrus, dating from the reign of Ramesses III, records the first known labour strike in documented history. Workers at Deir el-Medina, the elite tomb builders of the Valley of the Kings, stopped work and sat down outside the administrative buildings, refusing to continue until their rations were paid. Their complaint was specific. They had not received their grain rations for months. The document records their words directly. They said they were hungry. They had no clothing. They had no fish. And they had no vegetables. The administration's response was not to arrest them. It was to negotiate. Because the work could not continue without them, and everyone knew it. Tax pressure was the underlying driver. Administrative delays, corruption at intermediate levels, diversion of resources to military campaigns, and simple bureaucratic dysfunction meant that by the time rations were supposed to reach workers at Delta construction sites, the supply chain had often broken down. The experience of food insecurity, arbitrary authority, and labour exploitation was not exceptional in New Kingdom Egypt. It was systemic, and it was most severe for those at the bottom of the hierarchy: foreign workers, displaced populations, people with no patronage network and no administrative category that entitled them to compensation when the system failed. And tomb paintings at several New Kingdom sites depict overseers with raised sticks standing over groups of workers. The stick was not symbolic. Papyrus records include references to physical punishment as a disciplinary tool for slow production or missed work. The Book of Exodus describes an Egyptian overseer beating an Israelite worker, an event that triggers Moses' first act of resistance. Reading this against what Egyptian administrative records actually document, it is not a narrative invention. It is a realistic depiction of conditions that workers in the Egyptian labour system faced as documented reality. Now take the long view. The society described in the Book of Exodus was not created by the biblical authors from imagination. It was drawn from the lived experience of people embedded in one of the most sophisticated and most demanding civilizations of the ancient world. When the text describes Pharaoh's hard heart, it describes the theological and institutional rigidity of an ideology that had maintained the same basic structure for 1,500 years before Moses was born. When it describes Israelites making bricks, it describes a labour system documented in Egyptian administrative records with specific daily quotas. When it describes plagues disrupting Egyptian agriculture and economy, it describes vulnerabilities that Egyptian sources themselves acknowledge. The Anastasi Papyri, a collection of administrative letters from late New Kingdom Egypt, describe the eastern frontier in detail, including the names of specific guard posts, water sources, and procedures for tracking people crossing in either direction. The same texts describe fugitive foreign workers being pursued and caught by border officials. The route of escape, the geography of the Reed Sea crossing, and the character of the Sinai wilderness all have real coordinates in the ancient Near Eastern landscape. What emerges from this reconstruction is something more complex and more powerful than either a simple confirmation or a simple rejection of the biblical account. It is a picture of a real world in which a story like the one told in Exodus could realistically happen. A world with the exact power structures, the exact labour systems, the exact theological framework, and the exact vulnerable populations that the biblical narrative describes. Documented not just by the Bible, but by the Egyptians themselves, in administrative records, temple inscriptions, papyrus letters, and archaeological remains left behind in extraordinary quantity. When you read the opening chapters of Exodus knowing what you now know, the detail that strikes hardest is not the miracles. It is the ordinariness of the oppression. There is no dramatic announcement in Egyptian records that says these people were enslaved. There is only the steady bureaucratic machinery of ration lists, labour quotas, overseer reports, and frontier surveillance, quietly recording the existence of people who had no recognised freedom and no administrative recourse, continuing to function day after day as though this were simply the natural order of things. That is what makes the moment of the burning bush theologically explosive within the narrative. A voice from outside the Egyptian system speaking directly to a man formed within it, not through a temple, not through a scribe, not through a royal decree. A voice identifying itself not with Ma'at, not with Ra, not with Amun, but with the fathers of people who had no place in the Egyptian divine order at all. The confrontation between Moses and Pharaoh is, within its historical world, a confrontation between two completely different understandings of who holds authority over the cosmos. Pharaoh believes he is the axis around which the universe turns. The voice that speaks through Moses claims a different axis entirely. And the plagues, in this reading, function not as supernatural spectacle, but as systematic dismantling of every pillar of Egyptian theological confidence. The Nile turning red struck at Hapi, the god of the flood, and darkness over Egypt struck at Ra, the sun god whose daily journey was the foundation of Egyptian cosmic order. The death of the firstborn struck at Pharaoh's own divine lineage. Each catastrophe targeted a specific element of the theological framework that justified Egyptian imperial power. If you have never read the book of Exodus, knowing what the daily life of New Kingdom Egypt actually looked like, from the mud brick homes, to the ration lists, to the theology of Ma'at, to the frontier surveillance of the Eastern Delta, then in a real sense you have not yet read it fully. The people in those pages were real people who lived in real houses, ate real bread, ground real grain, carried real bricks, and suffered under a real system with real mechanisms for maintaining their subordination. The power that opposed that system was, in the account as written, entirely real as well. What changes when you know the world behind the story is not whether you believe the account. What changes is how much weight you feel when you read it. Because now you know what Pharaoh was protecting. You know what it cost to say no to him. You know what it meant for an entire population of labourers to rise and walk out of the most powerful empire in the ancient world, through marshes that Egyptian border officials monitored by name, into a wilderness that no administrative record had ever organised for them. That departure, if it happened as described, was not simply a religious event. It was the collapse of a labour system, the disruption of an agricultural economy, the failure of a border enforcement apparatus, the defeat of a theological claim maintained in stone for 15 centuries. The question worth sitting with, after walking through this world from the Nile to the temple, to the labour camp to the eastern frontier, is not simply whether the Exodus happened. It is this: when ordinary people living inside an overwhelming system of power, with no political voice, no legal standing, and no recognised place in the theological order of their world, find a way to say they belong to a different story entirely, what do we call that moment?